to show you some of the basics related to selecting and launching an EC2 or Elastic Cloud Compute instance. In this video, I'll show you how to select among common options for an EC2 instance, how to secure access to that instance using security keys, and lastly, I'll show you how you would modify that instance to install a simple web server. Let's get started. After you've logged in, you will find yourself at the console home, and you can either search for EC2 from the search box, from clicking on the services icon, or you might just see an icon on your home page. So let's go ahead and click that. Once you're here, the place that you might like to start is on the Ec2 Dashboard. And if you go to the Ec2 Dashboard, one of the links that you can click on is Launch Instance. So let's go ahead and click on that, and then select Launch Instance. Notice that there is a 7-step wizard that you go through here. One of the first things that you're going to be selecting is the base operating system and anything installed on it that you want to have. In later steps, you'll be selecting the hardware configuration. This is just which version of an operating system you want to use. As you scroll through the list on this page, you'll notice that it starts off with an Amazon Linux 2 option. And there are other options like Red Hat Linux, SUSE, Ubuntu, etc. There's also Windows instances that are available, and on and on. You could filter your list if you just type the name of something that would appear in the title. For our purposes, I'm going to use the Amazon Linux 2, the most current one, and select that one. Okay, in the second page, we see a list of hardware configurations that are available for our instance. Notice that we have information about the family, meaning the general configuration of that thing. Is it compute optimized? Is it general purpose, etc.? So there are a handful of different family types that are available that are, and some are better and some are worse for different types of applications. And they have names within a particular family that correspond to the amount of memory and the amount of virtual CPUs that are assigned to it. Keep in mind that with an EC2 instance, really we're talking about a virtual machine. And so what this means is that on the back end, AWS has a big beefy piece of hardware. Maybe it's got 16 CPUs on it, or 32 CPUs and 64 gigs of RAM. And you're getting a slice of that that's going to be isolated from all the other computers on that physical piece of hardware. There are different options related to storage. We don't have to worry about that, and really anything else over here at this particular moment. But note that if you had demands for high network performance, you could select some options related to that. As I scroll up and down, you'll notice that some of the CPUs for a particular instance type could be 36 or even higher, and that the amount of RAM could be 60 gigabytes or higher. For doing a demonstration and for simple tasks when you're trying things out, oftentimes using the smaller ones such as T2.micro are recommended. Now at this point it gives you an option of reviewing your selections and launching, or you can continue on through the wizard and look at the other options that are available. So let's go ahead and go on to the next one. Now notice that because we could have already clicked review and launch, changing these default options is optional. But let's just kind of talk about what's here. On this particular page, we can do things like select how many instances we want to launch at once. Another thing to note is that every instance is launched into a network. Now, AWS provides a default network for you, which I believe will allow you to put 65,536 different instances into it. And the 65,536 instances are each assigned to a unique IP address. So there's a network with 65,536 IP addresses roughly that are available, and those are divided into different subnets. If you don't select anything, it's going to drop it into a subnet. And notice here that for this particular region of the country, which is Northern California, there are 2 different subnets. What this also means, if you know about AWS's architecture, is you might think about this as one data center versus another. Other things, do you want it to auto-assign it an IP address? If this was a Windows machine, you might join it to a directory service. I'm not going to worry about that. You can do other interesting things like allow it to be the hard drive to be saved when you stop it, and so that way you're not incurring the cost of running it, but you could have the hard drive saved somewhere. By default, that's not enabled. It costs extra money to have a hard drive set aside for when you start back up an instance. Down here at the bottom, another interesting thing is if you know anything about bash scripting, you can paste bash scripts into here in this little box called user data. As it is, we're just going to allow our instance to be put into one of these data centers that have, and for both of these data centers called availability zones, they're both contained in an overall network address range specified here. And for people that are early on in their career and don't necessarily understand networking very well, you can just select the default options and go on to the next page. All right, on this page, we are allowed to select storage for our instance. The default is 8 gigabytes of storage. Note that as you increase the amount of storage for your machine, that is going to cost you more money, of course. You can have additional hard drives, or really they're virtual hard drives, but you can add additional ones and pay additional costs for that if you would like. One of the later steps here is to add tags. The reason for adding tags is, well, there are several things. One of them, let me just click on this box here. You have a key and a value, and basically you can just put anything you want here. So I might say purpose, and I'll say demo. So one reason you might do this is as you create new things and new resources in AWS, it can get complicated if you're running lots of projects. So you might say production server over here is the value, or test server, or staging server. Another thing that comes into play, among many others, is that if you give things a certain label, then you're able to interact with it programmatically, such as allowing AWS to start up instances and stop them on your behalf, but you have to say which ones it's allowed to interact with, and so tagging can specify which instances a service is supposed to interact with for automated purposes. All right, and then lastly, we have our security group, and this is their wording for a firewall. As it is right now, I'm going to allow it to create a new security group. It's going to give it a name, and it's going to call it Launch Wizard 1 and give it a description. And the important part right here is what traffic is it going to allow into this computer. And as I look from left to right here, it's going to allow in SSH traffic only at this point, and it's going to allow it on port 22, and it's going to allow it from any place on Earth. Now, the recommended thing for allowing SSH access, which is your administrative access, is to select My IP or some other limited range. Right now, I'm recording this from my home office, so if I selected this option, you would see my home Google Fiber IP address pop up. I won't put it there just in case somebody would use that for nefarious purposes. But this is a good practice if I'm only going to be accessing it from home. All right, later on, I'm going to add to this to allow a different kind of traffic, which is port 80 traffic, which is web traffic. But I'm not going to do that just yet. Right now, I'll just keep it locked down, and I'll allow everybody to get in, although normally I wouldn't do that. So let's go ahead and click Review and Launch. It gives a summary of everything that you selected, and you click Launch. Now on this page, it says, do you have a key pair that you're going to use to log into your machine? In the past, we used to log into Linux machines using just a username and password, but a preferred way to do this is to have basically your security credentials downloaded into a file that's kept on your local computer, and using that as your username and password or in place of it. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a new key pair, and I'll call this Demo AWS, and I need to remember that name, and I'm going to download it, and I'll put it in downloads. So let's remember this, Demo AWS. And note that when it downloaded it, it called it demoaws.cer. Sometimes it'll call it .pem. I'm going to rename it to .pem shortly, but it's available on my local computer. So I'm going to go ahead and hit launch now. Now, as it's launching, if I scroll down to the bottom of the page, I can click on this link right here, or this button, and I go over to this page. And the important message here is that the instance state is pending. Because it's a virtual machine and not a real independent computer, if it was an independent computer, it would take a long time for somebody to go into a data center and install some software and have it working. But because this is a virtual machine on an existing machine, it doesn't take too long. And it took only about 5 to 10 seconds for this to change to a running state. All right, I'd like to log into it soon, but before I do that, let's go ahead and click on this checkbox here. When I do that, I can see all kinds of interesting features of this computer that's now running in the cloud. So one of them is I can see that it has a public IP address, so I can interact with it via that IP address. Or instead of using that IP address, down here there's a public IPv4 address. And so this is an address as well, and I'll be using that in the near future. It also has on the back end a private address in case you're, well, there's a variety of reasons for this, but as an example of how you might use this, different instances could communicate with one another in your network by accessing each other's private networks. But in terms of accessing it from the internet or from home, this is the way that you would use it. You would access its public IP address. Okay, let's look at some of the other things here. So I click here, and here's security, and importantly, it shows security group, which is a firewall. If I right click on here and open this up in a new tab, this is going to tell me about my firewall rules. Now, if you recall, when we set this up, we were allowing in port 22 traffic, and that is listed right here. If I want to add to these permissions, I can click Edit Inbound Rules, and I'll be all right. Coming back over to here, there are other features, stuff about your network, storage, if you need to be reminded of that, how things are doing. You can set status checks to see if the health of your instance is good. Sometimes they do have problems. There are graphical reports that come up here, and you can see the tags that were assigned to this particular instance. Okay, we don't need to use that, but we do need to connect. So let's go ahead and click Connect to this instance that it was selected. And note that I had the checkbox over on the left-hand side selected. And this, if I go over to the third option, SSH client, allows me to SSH from a terminal window on a computer. I'm using a Mac, which has a good terminal window installed with it. Your Windows machines will be able to do something similar. And notice that if I go down to step 4, it shows me how I would log into this computer. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this icon right here, and it's just going to copy all of the text that's right there. Okay, but maybe I should, before I do that step, note that it gives me 4 steps that I'm supposed to go through. So let's just go ahead and do it that way. So I'm going to open up a terminal, and then I'm going to change to my downloads folder where I have that file, and I need to change the permissions on it. So by default, this password file, if you will, this security key, is not usable until it's secured, and so we'll just not explain it today and just say this locks it down. And I called it demoaws.cer, so I'm following the instructions there. Now notice it downloaded it as that name right there. I'm gonna go ahead and close that, and then bring this back up again. And I'm just gonna rename it. Sometimes on some computers, when it downloads, it comes down as a PEM file. It doesn't really change anything to call it with a different extension. I'll show you the contents of it just so you get a feel for it. So I'll say, show me the contents of this. And notice it's a bunch of text, and it says it's an RSA private key file. So I don't worry about showing this to you because I'm about to delete it and I'm never going to use it again. I'll even go up to the top and show it to you. Plus, I don't think I would want to copy this by hand, since you can't just copy paste. But this is the contents of it, and as long as I secure it properly, it will allow me to log into my EC2 instance without typing in this as my username and password. Okay, so now that I have the right name for my file, and it's actually included right here if it's a .pem file, I can take this command and paste it in, and I'll hit that, and it says, "Are you sure you want to connect?" And I'll say, "Yes, I do." Okay. Now, at this point, the only way I can interact with this EC2 instance is if I am using a terminal window like this and using the SSH, the Secure Shell program. Usually we would, well, not always, but sometimes we will log into a computer like this and we will install some software directly. And so in this case, let me just show you a demonstration of how I might install Apache on here. Now, Apache can only, now it's a web server and it can only listen on port 80, and port 80 is not open in our firewall yet, but we'll address all of those issues. So first, it's good practice for security to update our security patches and all of the libraries on our computer. So this is going to update the Linux operating system. So sudo yum update, and then -y means I don't have to type yes at some point during this process that it's doing right now. And after just a moment, I can then issue a command that will install an Apache web server. So I'll do sudo yum install yes httpd. And this is installing the Apache web server. It is now installed, but it is not started yet. To start it, I'll do sudo systemctl start httpd. And even though it didn't show us anything, I feel confident that it is running on the back end. Now, the question is, how do we access this? Well, let's come back over to this window right here. And if I go back to just the main page, EC2, I can see which instances are running. I click on it here, and here is the DNS name for this. So if I copy this and paste it, and I put it right here, it's actually not going to work. And the reason why it's not going to work is because the firewall is only allowing in port 22 traffic, and this requires port 80 traffic. So let's go ahead and fix that. I'm going to go over here to the security group that I opened up before. Again, if you ever needed to get to it again, you could just go to your security tab and click on security groups. And once you're there, we want to edit our inbound rules. I will say add a rule, and I will select what type of traffic I want to allow in, and I want to allow in HTTP traffic, and I will allow it in from anywhere, and I will click save. And with that rule applied, momentarily, this should work over here. It seems to be taking a moment, so let me just stop it. Type this in again. Okay, there was a little bit of pause, perhaps while this was this setting was taking place, but it works. And so if you knew how to update Apache and go into the right folders, you could now go in and start changing web pages. Right now, a default one is being displayed. Now, if you were doing this along with me, you probably want to get rid of some stuff. So let's go back and clean up some of the things that we have created. So I'm going to go back to my instance and do instance state terminate with this checkbox checked. I want to terminate it. Okay, and it's going to take a few minutes for it to actually do this. Here's a little refresh icon. Okay, so it was filtered a little bit, but notice that it's in the shutting down state. While it's in the shutting down state, if I were to go over here on the left-hand side navigation to security groups, I could find the security group that was listed before. It doesn't cost any money to have this Launch Wizard 1 sitting there. The instance does cost money while it's running, but not the security group, the firewall rule. So I could just leave it there forever, or if I wanted to get rid of it, I could go ahead and click Actions and then delete security group for this particular one after I've selected it. Sometimes it'll tell me no. In this case, it said yes. It would say no if this was still in the process of shutting down. But now that it's completely terminated, I was able to delete it. And so with that, I've cleaned up my resources. I could also go and delete the key pair that I just created. And so if I go over here to key pairs, I could go over here to demo AWS. I could get rid of that as well, unless I plan to use it in the future. In this case, I do not plan on using it in the future, so I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of it. Type delete into the field. And now that key pair, the part of the key that is downloaded on my local computer, is no longer useful. If I want to launch another instance, then I would need to create a new one. All right, so now you've learned a little bit about the basics of selecting and launching an EC2 instance.